Guys, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I really do appreciate it. I mean, I love doing these things. It's just a lot of fun to meet a lot of you, see a lot of faces that I talk to a lot on the radio. So I appreciate the invitation a lot. And I'm happy to do this again. If you ever have a need to do another presentation, I'm happy to take care of it. Yeah, I was born back east. Let me move this out of the way. I was born back east, got my double E degree in Ohio. We used to call it the mistake on the lake, but then Bill and Dave offered me a job in California. So I decided, yeah, why not? So I came out here and retired about almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, after working at HP, Cisco, Flex, and a bunch of startups. Really, really enjoyed Silicon Valley. I didn't want to retire because I was having too much fun, but now that I'm retired, I realize every day truly is a Saturday. Got a great wife, 5 grown kids, a lot of grandkids. Love to play golf. I'm not very good. I play bogey golf. Love to hike. Like to combine my radio activities with a backpack and such. Do a lot of music. But POTA is really my big radio passion. I've done over 900 activations now. Looking forward to my 1,000th one. Maybe this year. We'll see. Over 70,000 QSOs, and I do sideband. I got my extra passing 25, no, it was 20 words a minute back then in the 90s, but I really haven't used it as much. Maybe at some point I'll get back into it, but right now I'm primarily sideband. One of the most important things to remind you is that you can take notes if you want, but you don't have to. Everything that I do is a subset. These are slides that I pulled from my antennas primer, and everything is always for free. Always for free. And so I don't know if you guys have seen these links, but these links are out there. I also have an email list that I keep, a couple thousand people on there. So whenever I update an antenna or produce a new antenna, I send it out there first. So if you are interested in that, just send me an email. It's good on QRZ. But you can see I keep all my antennas, and these are living documents. I update these probably once a month at least, because as I learn new things, as I talk to people, as I get questions that I felt I should have answered, then I include them in the write-up. So they're living documents. They're always there. I am a geek, and I'm very proud of that. I did spend a lot of time in math and physics in college, but nowadays, when it comes to antennas, I want to understand the fundamentals, but only about 5% of my time. I really got into modeling about 4 or 5 years ago when I first started POTA. I felt that I didn't want to spend a lot of money on buying an antenna. And so I started modeling, and I designed what I called my perfect antenna. It became the Performer, but my perfect antenna at the time, and really had a lot of fun with the software. In Silicon Valley, we live on postage stamps. And so oh yeah, I'm supposed to tell you, if you're everyone mute except for me, because there's no background noise that way. There you go. Thank you. We live on postage stamps, but my backyard is big enough for me to do all of my testing. And I've got at least a half dozen more antennas that I'm playing with right now in the backyard, trying to decide which ones are the most effective. But in the end, this is why I love POTA, because it's a perfect real world evaluation. Hunters are the subjects. They tell me, I've done a lot of ABC tests on antennas in the field. Which one's louder? How does it sound? Blah, blah, blah. And so that's one of the other reasons I do POTA, because it's a great way to evaluate antennas. I spent 45 years in Silicon Valley, and we were always driven by design principles. Whenever you talk about a new technology, a new product, you got to focus on your priorities. Why are you doing what you're doing? What problem are you trying to solve? In this case, what are my design principles? First and foremost, performance. I am obsessed with radiation efficiency. I only do resonant antennas. I don't believe in using tuners unless it's absolutely necessary. One band at a time, and I like one band at a time because it's a predictable radiation pattern, and also you can manage it so that it is highly efficient. So all of my antennas are at least 90% efficient. What does that mean? You put 100 watts in, you get 90 watts radiated out, at least 90%. That's a big one for me. Secondly, it's elegance. I like Apple. I love clean, simple designs, but yet with a tremendous amount of performance built in. So in my case, fast and simple deployment when it comes to antennas. That includes setup and takedown, 5 minutes or less. Typically for me, now that I've done it so many times, a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. But I call that elegance. And thirdly, convenience. It has to be easy to pack for backpack ops as well as picnic table, POTA. I love doing that. One thing I didn't expect when I first started doing this and sharing designs for free, and now I estimate about 30%, about a third of my antennas are used in HOA deployments. I don't know how much of that is. It's really typical back east. I don't know about Washington State, but there's a lot of HOA folks in neighborhoods back east in the Midwest, and they need an antenna they can set up, a very effective antenna they can set up, use it, and then take down. And so I found out that HOA folks use it a lot. So I'm really pleased about that. All right, I am going to talk a few antenna geeky things, but I promise I'll keep it very high level. And these are very relevant and pertinent to the antennas that I work on. I think all of you that got your license should remember this equation. Z impedance equals resistance, that's the real, plus the imaginary reactance. And we all know what J stands for, don't we? The square root of -1. Isn't that exciting? You all know that. But when you look at an antenna, especially when it's a resonant antenna, reactance, capacitive or inductive, does equal to 0. So impedance equals R, the resistance. Think of the antenna as here's your source, here's the ground, as two resistors in series to ground. You have a good resistor called radiation resistance, and you have a bad resistor called loss resistance. It's like yin and yang, right? You always have to have a good thing and a bad thing kind of working together, and hopefully good overwhelms the bad. Radiation resistance is the total power radiated in all directions. That's productive energy. So that's the power you put in and apply to your antenna. However, the bad resistor, that includes any conductor RF resistance, losses in your insulators, and any other elements. But most importantly and most significantly, and the part that hopefully you can control the most, are ground losses and absorption in the near field. That's where people waste a lot of energy. I see so many antennas. People get these great, oh, I got 1.1 SWR, and they got these two radios laying on the ground, and they're losing 2/3 of their power into the earth. They're just warming up the dirt. That's all they're doing. But they still make contacts. That's not bad, but it's not good enough. So the beauty of knowing these two resistors is it also helps you determine, and there's a full page of calculations to get to this point, but the equation is relatively simple. It's the good resistor, the efficiency is the good resistor over the sum of the good and the bad resistor times 100%. So when you look at that equation, you don't need to be an engineer to say, well, what's the goal? The goal is to minimize the loss resistance, because then you get 1 times 100% or 100% efficient. Those don't exist, but you can definitely get over 90%. So remember, the good resistor is converted. That's the resistor that converts radio waves and productive energy. The bad resistor just is wasted energy. It goes into the ground, or it heats up components around it. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. This is where it gets interesting. And this, I tell you, this slide shocked so many people. And when I first saw it 5 years ago, when I was doing my research, I was amazed. John Oppenheimer is brilliant. He's, much smarter man than I am when it comes to this, but he actually wanted to find out, he says, we all can measure our radiation resistance, right? We know that in a simple quarter wave, it's when fed at the bottom, it's 37 ohms. That's your good resistor. But how do I get loss resistance? How do I actually measure that? Well, he figured out that you can measure your feed point resistance. You can then calculate what the radiation resistance should be, and the difference should be your loss resistance. And he went through this process many, many times, and it was replicated by many other smart hams out there. And he came up with this amazing series of numbers, which I turned into a pretty chart because I think it's easier to understand. And you look at this curve and it just amazes you. So let's just pretend that you've got two radials on the ground, your feed point's on the ground, and you only have a ground loss of 85 ohms. You go, well, 85 ohms, Greg, that's pretty small. I mean, why should I be concerned about a loss resistance of 85 ohms? Well, plug it in your equation. Remember I said a quarter wave fed at the bottom, the radiation resistance is 37 ohms. 37 is in the numerator. The sum of the denominator is 37 plus 85. When you do the calculations, that's 30%. You put in 100 watts, you get 3 watts out, radiated. you get a great SWR probably, and so you're happy with that. But you get a great SWR with a dummy load. It doesn't radiate, or barely. So I think we can do better than that. So let's go through the same type of equation and look at 4 radials, which is the most typical for ham radio operators doing portable type ops. 4 radials only gives you 37% efficiency. I've seen some hams, POTA guys go out there with 8 radials. They get 47%. So they lose half their power into the ground. All the way, it takes 64 radials to get 80% efficiency. I mean, it just amazes me. When you look at these numbers, you say, wow, I never knew how inefficient these antennas were, even with great SWR. Well, comparatively, if you elevate those radials, and I've done this initially through computer models, and then I did some of my own testing in the field and found out that when you elevate just 2 radials, your loss resistance is 4 ohms. When you plug that in your equation, you get 90%. And that's what gave birth to my first antenna, the Performer antenna. Now, he wasn't the only one. I think he was inspired by Rudy Severance. I'm sure many of you have heard of Rudy. He's done a lot of QST work, especially about a decade ago. He did this really amazing analysis on 40 meters. And what he did is he created a normalization point. He said, I'm going to put 4 radials on the ground for 40 meters. And he had no ground stakes, and he had it choke isolated like you should. And he put 4 radials on the ground, and he kept increasing the number of radials. And I think he stood about, he measured about a wavelength away, and he measured the radiation, the field strength, if you will, and with 4 radials on the ground being the 0 dB point. And as he went all the way up through increasing number of radials, and this is gain improvement on the y-axis, he said, yeah, well, right around 32 radials, we've all heard this, there's an inflection point, but once you put down 64 radials, you get a full almost 6 dB or S unit improvement in terms of the actual field intensity of your radiated signal. And that was pretty interesting. He said, well, let me try something different. This time, instead of increasing the number of radials, let's take those same 4 radials and start elevating them. Guess what happened? The y-axis is the same. The y-axis is the gain improvement over 4 radials on the ground, or 0 feet above ground. He found on 40 meters, when he raised those 4 radials just 6 inches off the ground, he already got 5 dB improvement in terms of field intensity. And he kept going all the way up to 4 feet, and he absolutely exceeded 64 radials on the ground by elevating 4 radials just 4 feet off the ground. That's incredible. If you think about that when I saw all this, I said, okay, I've got to come up with an antenna that can do this. And then I started to figure out, but why does that work, right? Well, remember, those of you that took physics class in high school, you remember a capacitor. You have 2 plates. As the plates are moved further from each other, the capacitance goes down inverse to the distance between the plates. So think of a radio like a capacitor, right? Now, why is a radial on the ground so susceptible to having a capacitance coupling to the ground? Well, 1, it's on the ground, but 2, it has a lot of current. When you've got a resonant antenna, right? You all know this. Here's your half-wave dipole. You get a standing wave with both current and voltage, and they're 90 degrees out of phase. And it looks pretty much like this, with your current peak at the center and your voltage peak, if you will, at the impedance peak, which is at the ends. So current maximum, radiation max, because it's current is what radiates. Current is what radiates, not voltage. Current is what radiates. That's at the center of your half-wave antenna. And if it's fed in the middle and it's horizontal, it's 73 ohms. The voltage maximum, or the radiation minimum, is at the ends. So when you have a quarter wave antenna, right? So you take this piece and you put that straight up to the air, you've got a lot of current. And here's your feed point on the ground, and here's your radial. Look at all the current you have laying on the ground. And if you leave it like that, that radiated current is going to get absorbed into the earth, because that's the other half of the antenna, right? Now, as you move down near the end of the half-wave antenna, You start talking about an off-center fed half wave, or especially an end-fed half wave, you're pretty much at the end. And so you get very little current here. So you could actually have your counterpoise wire. A lot of people like to use for a multi-band end-fed half wave 5% counterpoise. You can do that because you're not going to lose, you're not going to absorb any the potential radiation current into the ground on a counterpoise. But you got to use a counterpoise on an end-fed half wave. I'm sorry, there's no way you can't use one without it. Okay, so that's why it's so important, especially on a quarter wave, to get this radial off the ground because it's full of so much current, especially the first half of it. So what did that give birth to? That gave birth to my performer antenna. And you see here in 3 configurations, we'll talk about these. It's a quarter wave vertical, elevated feed point, as well as elevated tuned linked radials. And we'll talk about that. Performer, PER, portable, elevated, resonant. It's a quarter wave for 40 to 60 meters, the primary bands that people are on. You can either, this is my favorite implementation, sitting on this is furniture grade PVC on a chameleon spike in the ground. But you can't always put a spike in the ground, especially when the ground is frozen. So a lot of people like to use a tripod. So it works both ways, pretty much the same type of performance. I computer modeled them to verify that what I was thinking I was getting, I really was getting. And I typically get not only radiation efficiency over 90%, because the programs calculate that as well, but I get very low SWR on a resonant antenna. And it's also designed to be very lightweight and easy to deploy. So what is it? What's the key to it? Well, it's real simple, right? Here's your telescoping whip, which is your variable. This is your tuning element, if you want to call it that. Here's a picture basically of the tube version, but the tripod is basically the same thing. I keep the feed point up 4 to 5 feet, typically around 52 inches, because this is a 40-inch PVC tube, and that's somewhere around 52 inches. Remember, in a quarter wave, I said there's a lot of current here, right? So you want to keep the feed point off the ground as well. And you have to choke it because you don't want any common mode currents on the coax to come back and bite you. And as well as it also protects RFI as well. But how do I deploy it? Well, these are 2 elevated radials. Elevated meaning they're off the ground, anywhere from 52 inches down to 36 inches. These are 90 degrees apart. 90 degrees apart, and I'll show you why when I get into some of the radiation graphs and such. They have to be tuned. When you elevate radials off the ground, unlike ground-coupled radials, when you elevate them off the ground, they have to be tuned because they literally are the other half of the antenna. So rather than having different wires for each of the bands, I basically said, okay, for 6 meters, the radial length, because I calculated these in the computer model and I also tested them in the field. Here's the length for 6 meters. It has to be the molar clip, which is attached to the mirror mount, is about 1.5 inches. The 6 meter radial is about 41.5. So that's about 43 inches, right? And then you adjust your whip accordingly. If you want 10 meters, you want like another 37 inches. And so the way you do that, you just have a little spade connector, which I deployed here, and you added just an incremental length. So if you add up this 43 plus that's 37, that's 80 inches. So now you have 2 80-inch radials elevated off the ground for 10 meters, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's 2 ways to accomplish that. Notice I have a really good spade connector kit, which I'll show you in a moment. But you can handle it one of 2 ways. When I first started, I would just literally take off the rest of these segments, clip the end of the 10-meter radial to the end of the stake. I'd have to move the stake in for each band change or out for each band change. After I did it a while, I realized there's got to be a better way. I'm tired of moving these stakes, and let's make it faster. So I thought of a better idea. And it actually happened on an airplane as we were driving down to see our grandkids in San Diego. My wife was playing her little phone games, and I was thinking, how can I make this easier to change bands? And I go, oh, I got an idea. And when I got home, I deployed it, and it worked really well. In my case, I just took a 4-inch piece of paracord, put on a couple of spade connectors. It can be anything non-conductive. I know a lot of guys have used weed whacker, twine, anything plastic, etc. But I said, well, what if I insert this little non-conductive segment in between the 2 radials that I want to work with. So for example, if I want 10 meters, I take, normally I have at the end, I have each one here and one here. But if I take this segment, unhook it from the end, put it between the 10 and 12, what happens? Beautiful. The antenna in the radial line only goes to 10. It doesn't see the rest of this, and it has no impact on the performance. So it's a real fast and simple way. You put your two stakes in the ground in 90 degrees apart, and you just keep moving your segment, because these are your constants per band, and I have it calculated to be roughly in the center of each of the band. And then your telescoping whip is your tuning variable, and that allows you to tune it exactly where you want it, whether it's on the sideband end or the CW digital end. You can tune it exactly where you want it, very fast. I mean, it's one band at a time, but I can change bands in under a minute right now. I just walk over, change the segment, adjust the whip, done. All right, so now let's talk about the tripod deployment first. And by the way, this is an old tripod. There's a newer version now, which I'll show you in a minute, but I strongly recommend the new Polar Duck 78-inch tripod. It goes for about 40 some odd bucks on Amazon. Notice what it doesn't have. It doesn't have a center plate to limit the span of the legs. So not only are these legs telescoping if the ground is uneven, but these legs can go all the way flat if you just want to put the whole thing on the ground if it's really windy, or it can go much taller as well. So it's incredibly flexible. I love it. Very lightweight, very compact. Here's the Muller clip I was telling you about, and I combine the two radial segments at that Muller clip. And at the other end, there's a Muller clip on each one of the radials, the elevated radials, which can attach to any kind of non-conductive stake. This is a fiberglass tomato stake. The first time I was experimenting with the antenna, I was using tomato stakes I had in the garden shed. Turns out there's a core metal rod that runs down the middle of those. And I couldn't figure out why my radials were so short till I cut one open and realized there's a piece of metal. So make sure it's either hollow or that it's got no metal in it. And a lot of guys right now are using driveway markers, especially back east where there's a lot of snow, and in Washington probably too. You've got those too. They're really cheap on Amazon, $3 or $4 for a whole bunch. This is the deployment that I like because the ground is fertile and soft relatively, even during the winter here in California. I use furniture grade PVC tube because the walls are slightly thicker, 40 inches and such, and I put it on a chameleon spike. At the base of the PVC tube, I just put a classic 38 by 24 bolt and nut at the bottom. If you don't want to put a spike in the ground, you can use something like the WRC Megapod, and they are still taking orders. You can still get one of those, or any kind of little mini tripod. I've seen a lot of guys use umbrella stands and things like that because it won't affect it because you've got all this non-conductive PVC between it. At the top, of course, I use the coupling nut for the mirror mount, and here's the mirror mount. I have a little threaded rod which I screw into there, attach the mirror mount to it, and this thing is the way I store it in the trunk of my car. Pull it out, stick it in the ground. It's all set to go. The choke's already attached with a little barrel connector there, so I just attach my coax and it's ready to go. I love this performer. The radial wires, as I said, when you elevate your radials, they have to be tuned to the band. So I calculated them to be tuned to the center of each of the ham bands. I use 18 gauge wire. You don't want to use too heavy a wire because it sags too much, right? So 18 gauge wire, I like orange, a little bit more visible. I use spade connectors. You can use whatever you want. If you don't have a good set of connectors, strong recommendation. And I don't make money from any of my recommendations. I just like things that work and I share them. Wi-Fi, it's available on Amazon. They have a great crimping tool, and they have all their spade connectors have heat shrink tubing already built in and internal glue. So they're incredibly strong, incredibly tight. They never come apart. If the metal gets a little weaker and they get a little looser, you just take a little plier and squeeze them together and to make them tighter, and you're good to go. I've been using these now in the field for 5 years, the same spade connectors. They're amazing. I mentioned the non-conductive segments. You can see I put the spade connectors on those as well. Easy to do. Again, if you use plastic wire, same thing. Then I tie everything up, put a little Velcro strap on them, label them. You got to label them because you don't want to get mixed up. and I put the whole thing in a little toiletry bag you get on Amazon for a couple of dollars. And you could see the Wolf River Coil Sporty 40. That's what you use for 40 meters. I just recently bought the new Chameleon 40 meter coil. Really like it. It's about half the size. It resonates a little higher than this one, but I'm going to use it instead of the Sporty 40 going forward. I like it a lot. So that's the Chameleon one. There's also a backpack version. The backpack version uses slightly narrower PVC tube. I cut it in half, put a little coupler on one end. I glue everything in, of course. You can see I still have, there's the coupling nut on top and the bolt on the bottom. Here's the spike and the antenna. Again, you can bring the WRC Megapod if you want. I put everything in my ICOM 705 backpack, and it looks just like that. And I backpacked the Performer antenna up into the hills and just absolutely love the way it works up there. I've had tremendous success with it. By the way, I use Messi and Poloni Airborne 5 coax. If you're looking for extremely lightweight, highly efficient coax, I recommend it. It's got the best numbers in the world. ABR is great too, American made, but this Italian made stuff is pretty darn good. The model, of course, chunks out lots of numbers. Efficiency over 90%, SWR. These are the average numbers across all the bands, 20 through 6. Reflection coefficient, astonishing, minus 44 dB. Anything greater than minus 20 dB is fantastic, but 44 is amazing. It's a directional vertical antenna. You get modest gain, average of 0.41 dBi with a front to back a little over 3 dB. It's amazing. So you get double your power out the front versus the back. And the directivity works, believe me. It definitely works. It has an effect. It's got a takeoff angle, the max radiation angle, about 24 degrees. And if you're not familiar with beam width is what are the minus 3 dB points from that max radiation angle. It's a total of 44 degrees. So it's got a very reasonably concentrated beam width. So even though it's a vertical antenna, it has a beam width with some directivity off the front side. The model, of course, produces amazing pictures. So that's why I'm a geek and I love this kind of stuff. This is the top view. The red and the purple are the strongest radiation coming off the antenna. These are the two elevated radials. So you can see the maximum radiation occurs pretty much on this half of the antenna, but the purple is between the span of the two radials at 90 degrees apart. And yes, I did experiment in the model everywhere from 20 degrees apart to 120 degrees apart, and 90 by far had the best numbers. And you can see the side view. Isn't that gorgeous? Look at that. Look at that. You even get a little bump there for some NVIS. It's kind of funny. It works though. And you can see the model. Here's the side view in the model. And of course, this happens to be for 10 meters, a very low reflection coefficient. But here's reality, right? I mean, you can talk about it. You can show models and everything looks pretty, but in reality, this was actually taken at Marshall Cottle Park, Uncle Sam 3473, where I've worked some of you. And I've taken these measurements on all the bands. You can see not only is it very low, but it's very broadband. Obviously, you can get 2/3 of the 20-meter band, the entire 20-meter band under 1.5 SWR. By the way, 1.5 SWR is very respectable. It's 96% efficient. Please don't use a tuner. You don't use a tuner if it's 1.5 or better, maybe even 1.6. Your antenna, most of these guys who are running 40% efficiency are obsessed with getting a 1.0 or 1.1. 1.5 is 96% efficient. It's far more efficient than your actual antenna is. So 1.5 or lower is very respectable. The entire 12-meter band, the entire 15-meter band under 1.2, the entire 17-meter or 12-meter band. The 10-meter band, you can get 2/3 of it under 1.5. If you want to work the FM simplex up here, you just kind of shorten the whip a bit and you move up there. And the same with the 50-meter band. I typically operate it down here, so I lengthen the whip a little bit and I can operate right there with a very nice SWR. What about an omnidirectional performer? Yes, that is correct. When you put the two radials 90 degrees apart, you get that directivity, and that's the red that looks like this. But if you want to be omnidirectional, let's say you're in the middle of the country or you don't care about the directivity, you put the radials opposite each other, 180 degrees apart. So you have a flexibility there. But let's take a look at the difference between the two, and you can automatically see a couple of big differences, namely here, here, and obviously there. Let's zoom in on that. Remember I said the takeoff angle is 24 degrees. Again, this is on 15 meters. So you get 0.31 dBi. On the 180 degree span, it's minus 0.67 all around. So you get about a dB more at the takeoff angle. Regional coverage is typically 30 to 60 degrees takeoff angle, and NVIS is typically 60 to 90 straight up. But look at the differences, and even regional coverage. This is why the Performer is so popular for POTA, because you get this 1.4 dB better when it's in their 90-degree position versus the omnidirectional position for regional coverage. And this, when I say regional, I'm talking 400, 500, maybe up to 700, 800 miles out. It's great for POTA in that regard. Obviously, NVIS, a lot of us don't use it, but a lot of e-coms folks do. And when they've used it for e-com, they get NVIS coverage, and you get about a plus 5 dB when you're in the 90-degree position versus the 180-degree position. So don't overlook this opportunity as well. And of course, off the backside, because there's a over 3 dB front to back, the omnidirectional, of course, is much stronger by 2.4 dB. Any questions on the Performer before I move on to the next one? Any questions?
Great antenna.
You use it?
No, but I've been reading about it, and I've been thinking about building one.
Build it. Build it, and then remember, I'm here. I'm your 24-hour-a-day support line. Not that I'm going to answer it right away, but I always, every morning, I have a routine now that I'm retired. You know, when you retire, you have to build your own infrastructure. Your whole life, you've had school, college, and your career. And then once you retire, you have to build your own infrastructure. So my infrastructure, my routine is I get up typically around 6:30, have 2 dark Italian roast cups of coffee, and that's when I do all my emails. And I get about a dozen emails overnight, and I try to respond to each one within 24 hours. So build one, and let me know if you have any questions. Happy to help. Okay, so that's a quarter wave antenna. And as far as I'm concerned, I can't imagine a better quarter wave multi-band, one band at a time antenna. I call it multi-band, but it's one band at a time, right? Why do I, you can have antennas which will do multiple bands without having to change radials and all that sort of thing. But see, again, I'm a geek for radiation efficiency. You're always making compromises. When you have a multi-band antenna, you may have one band that looks really good with a very predictable radiation pattern and great radiation efficiency, or reasonable, but the other bands may suck, right? So for me, I don't care about that convenience. I'll gladly take 30 to 60 seconds to change bands and have over 90% radiation efficiency with a radiation pattern that is predictable, and I know what it looks like. So here is, I mentioned the polar duck tripod earlier. That was an old photo. Here are newer photos showing now my half-wave antennas, and you can see it's the same thing. You can see this one's a little bit wider, no center plate to limit the span of the legs. It now has this big telescoping black tube on top, which you can either increase the length of the legs or keep the legs shorter and increase the length of the telescoping center section, or do both if you want it really high up. But that's why I love this tripod, and it's super lightweight. I have a picture of it. I also have a portable version, which I'll talk about. But let's talk about half-wave antennas. You remember this chart I showed earlier in the beginning in terms of a quarter wave and the loss resistance associated with a number of ground radials. And I said in radiation efficiency, your objective is to minimize your loss resistance as much as possible. On the other hand, in addition to that, you can also maximize your radiation resistance, the good resistor, as much as possible. And that's exactly what happens in a half-wave antenna. So this is only for mathematical purposes only. This is not the way you measure it, but just to kind of show you, as you raise the radiation efficiency of your antenna in a half wave and you feed it either off center fed or you feed it at the end where there's hundreds of ohms here or thousands of ohms here. Look what happens to the efficiency. Let's suppose worst case, you have 104 ohms ground loss. That would destroy your quarter wave antenna. You get 26% efficiency. But let's assume it's the same number. Like I said, this is a mathematical exercise only. But you increase the other number. Let's say it's an off-center fed in the hundreds. Oh, you're already up with that horrible loss resistance to 66%, or an end-fed half-wave is already 96%. That's why end-feds are half-wave antennas are so popular. They're on one band at least, they're highly efficient. However, just like I did with the quarter wave, I did my own modeling and field testing. I find with a single counterpoise wire, because why? Remember, there's not much current in the counterpoise wire. Unlike radials on the ground, the other half of the antenna, this is beyond the end of near the end of the antenna. So you have very little current. So you can lay it on the ground with no issues. And I found that the loss resistance is anywhere from 12 to 25 ohms, which will give you a tremendous radiation efficiency. Okay. So again, mathematical exercise only, just showing you now I'm increasing the radiation resistance, the good resistor, even if you have a bad resistor in there, okay? All right, let's talk about, I have two versions of the half wave. I have an off-center fed and I have an end fed. And obviously you have to use different components to make them work. This is the Challenger. I come up with these names, after 45 years in Silicon Valley, I get hooked on product names. And so I come up with these names. They're just for fun. In fact, the way I got the name of the Challenger, I was at a stoplight one day trying to think of what to call my antenna. And this big, beautiful black Dodge Challenger drove up next to me, revved his engine. And I go, ooh, Challenger. That's a good name for an antenna. So that's where I got it. The Dominator, that's the DX antenna. So you want a global domination. That's where I got that name. Again, there's both antennas on the tripod. Look how small the tripod folds up. And it folds up even smaller. You can even take these legs and put them up if you want. But I put all of these in a 36-inch photography bag and take it out to the field. And that's the whole antenna. There's your whip. I already pre-mount the unan on the tripod. And there's the counterpoise. And you're all done. That's the antenna. So they're both designed to be very lightweight, highly, highly efficient. Okay. So what are the components of this antenna? Well, just like with the Performer, your variable is your telescoping whip. It also uses a mirror mount, and the mirror mount then attaches to your tripod or whatever structure you have underneath it. When you do an off-center fed, you use an unan. I have a cheap version and I have an expensive version. This is the cheap version. The LDG, like $30, very inexpensive. Not as good a performer as the more expensive one, which I'll show you in a moment, but that attaches, it's already pre-mounted. I use one of these screws and I pre-mount the unan to the mirror mount, and then your link counterpoise. Now you have a link counterpoise, one segment for each of the bands. And just like with the quarter wave antenna, you have to have an RF choke. You do not want common mode currents running down the shield of your coax. And you also don't want to have a second counterpoise. You'll have a bizarre radiation pattern and poor efficiency. The Dominator is basically the exact same thing, except you swap out the 4-to-1 with a 49-to-1 transformer. And as a result, you've got a end-fed half wave. Again, one band at a time. This covers 20 to 6 meters, so it covers a lot of bands. This Dominator, this DX antenna, which I'll talk about in more detail in a second, only covers 10 to 17. You're limited by 49-to-1s don't get 6 meters just based on their components. And the 25-foot whip from Chameleon isn't long enough to get 20 meters, but that's okay. You got it here on the off-center fed. Again, all this is I give out these very detailed, probably 15 to 20 page PDFs with lots of pictures and lots of how-to and diagrams. And it gives all the segments you want to pre-cut, and you put spade connectors. Again, it's just one wire. I typically keep a 6-inch pigtail on the antenna that when I get in the field, you can see I just hook it up over here. And I keep a 1-foot pigtail between the unan positive and the base of the telescoping whip. I just use a ring terminal here. And that adds, literally, it adds another foot because it's 12 inches long to the length of the whip. So that helps. And then the Dominator is the same thing. The Dominator, there's the pigtail on the positive, and then there's the counterpoise off the negative. I really like the 1010s for 49-1, inexpensive on eBay. I know the guy in Tennessee that builds them. He does a beautiful job. So it's a good transformer. Nothing wrong with it. However, I'm a geek. So I know you can always do something better than what you think you can do. So here's your LDG, $30. Strong recommendation for this Palomar choke. It's a coax wrap toroid, F240 31 toroid. Noise reduction up to 32 dB, which is very good. Again, anything better than 20, lower than 20 is very good, and that's what you want. They only rate it to 30 megahertz, but I've used it on 6 meters. It's got pretty good insertion loss, relatively low, minus 3.34 dB. I used my Nano VNA to measure all these components because, again, I'm obsessed with efficiency. These two components together, you lose about 0.46 dB. However, strong recommendation, and I think it's worth the incremental money. I call that the Challenger. I call this the Challenger Plus. So you go from $30 to $70, but the extra $40 is worth it. The insertion loss is also very low, minus 24 dB, but the bandwidth is much broader. And on each of the bands, you'll see the bandwidth within a band is also much broader. They use a dual port ferrite bead mix 43. I take these apart and I'll show you the pictures next. They also make this even better choke, whereas this was up to minus 32 dB noise reduction. This is minus 42 dB. I love this thing. So I know guys that run it this way, $60. I know guys like me that run it this way. That's $140. I know that's expensive, but you get, you get very low insertion loss. I know a lot of guys that take this and they match it with this, and that's only $100. So you can go from 60 to 100 to 140. It's your choice. You have 3 different options. Just like the Challenger, the Dominator is the same. You've got the Dominator using the 1010 as 49-1. Here's the problem with a 49-1, and this is, a lot of guys that use their end-fed half waves, and I use one in my home shack, don't understand or don't realize, or no one's ever told them, at best. Now, I know you can spend a lot of money, build your own, wind your own, and get up closer to 90%, but most end-fed half wave transformers or ununs, the same thing, or 80%, or in the 80s, 80% efficient. And I measure this multiple times. It's 80% efficient. It's a very well made, but it's 80% efficient. And then you match it with that one and you lose over a dB. But let's do something better. I strongly recommend, again, my antenna is 56-1, right? So you're going from 49 to 56-1. You're moving out towards the end of the half wave, smaller, shorter counterpoise. The insertion loss is only minus 0.4 dB. That's 91.2%. You cannot get much better. I've never seen anyone build a 49 or 56-1 transformer better than 91, 92%. So you can get this for $89. That's another incremental, basically twice the cost. If you're into performance like me, I recommend it. You can either match it with that, or you can match it with this very low loss Palomar, a very high noise reduction Palomar. So only lose a half a dB with a combination of insertion loss. What do they look like inside? Again, I love taking things apart. Here's your LDG. It uses a 140-43 toroid mix for an unknown. Look at this. This is the Palomar. It uses that dual 1/4-inch port ferrite bead mix 43. Look how big it is. It's a completely different design technology. It uses a 1 1/8 height tall bead, and it's dual port, so it wraps the wire in around them many times, so it's a 4-to-1. And then look at this high performance choke. It uses again, I think it's probably, it is the same height, 1 1/8. It's different. It's a single port, but it uses 1 1/8 height mix 31. And by the way, for an ununs, you use a mix 43 for the HF bands. For a choke, you always use a mix 31. I know a lot of guys use a mix 43 for both. You shouldn't do that. You should use a mix 31 for your choke and a mix 43 for your unun. Here's the Dominator. He does a beautiful job. These are handmade in Tennessee. It uses a F240, a 240 versus 140. That means 2.4 inches diameter versus 1.4 inches diameter. That's what that nomenclature means. And of course, that's the mix. And you open up the Dominator. My gosh, look at that thing. This thing, its outer diameter is only 1.4, but it's 1 inch thick. And they claim, and I worked through the math. If you look at the volume of a cylinder, it may be narrower here, but it's taller, and this hole is smaller than that one. So it is equivalent to three 143, 140, 43 torite. So it's a beautiful transformer, strong recommendation, highly efficient. I use this at my home for my end-fed half wave. So the Challenger Plus, because it's a 4-to-1, is the same as the LDG in terms of its linked counterpoise. Because you've got a 56-to-1 versus 49-to-1, the Dominator counterpoise is going to be a little bit shorter, right? Because you're further on down the half wave antenna, so you need less. And being the geek that I am, when I was testing all these in my backyard, here's the Dominator Plus, and here is the Challenger Plus, and I was testing them side by side. I did take this out to a park one time, and I was A-B'ing the two antennas, and it was a lot of fun to do that. And I'll show you the differences between them, and I think that's coming up in a couple slides. Now these are all on a tripod. I show these on a tripod, but being that backpacker that I am, and I love to hike, I created backpack versions. I took a very relatively short, I think it's a 1 inch. I think it's a 1 inch, no, 1.25 inch outer diameter, only 16 inches long PVC tube, furniture grade. I got the bolt there on the bottom and the coupling nut on top. And of course, both antennas use a 25-foot whip. You can use a 17-foot whip. You just can't get 20 meters on one. And here's the spike. And here are the two, the counterpoises all wrapped up. And here they are, again, deployed in my backyard, but the way I deploy them in the field. In fact, it works so well. Unlike a quarter wave, you don't need to get the counterpoise. I mean, the feed point up is high. 2 feet is fine, at least 1 foot off the ground. But because you have very little current at this point in the antenna of a half wave, it's not as critical as it is in a quarter wave. So you can run it here with a short PVC tube. And this is about 2 inches. There's the feed point right there. That's about 2 feet, about 2 feet. That's the Challenger Plus. That's a Dominator Plus. And as I said, you can also put it on the Megapad. If the ground is frozen or you got rock underneath you, you can put it on a small tripod and it still works fantastic. And of course, I have a backpack version. It's the same as like I showed you earlier with the Performer. In this case, in the side pocket, there's the spike, there's the telescoping whip, and then there's the PVC tube. And notice I have a little spacer. When I build this thing, I build it with a little spacer, so it keeps the unun and the choke away from the PVC tube. It also allows you to sneak it in the pocket there so things don't get in the way. There's the strap. So it's very lightweight, and I've gone on QRP activations with this setup. And because this antenna is so efficient, when I apply 10 watts for my ICOM 7705, I get about 9.4, 9.3 watts radiated. So it's highly efficient, very important for QRP, obviously. Here are all the computer model numbers. Here are the averages down here. Structural efficiency, according to the model, is 94%. Depending on which unun you use, on an off-center fed, anywhere from 92 to 94.6%. SWR very low, very good reflection coefficient. It's an omnidirectional antenna, minus 0.27 dBi in all directions. Remember, the Performer was 24 degrees takeoff angle. This is 3 degrees lower, or 21 degrees. Remember the Performer, I think it was 44 degrees beam width. This is 32. So you get a lower takeoff angle and a more concentrated beam width. So it's a fantastic antenna, gives you lots of DX. The best DX antenna is the Dominator. I have worked over the pole. I have worked European parks from California, park to park, over the pole. It's amazing. Structural efficiency is very high. If you use the 49-to-1, it's 80% efficient. If you use the 50, what did I say? 56-to-1, it's the 91% efficiency. SWR very low across all the bands, very low reflection coefficient. Now you've got a true half wave antenna, so you get a positive dBi in all directions, 0.67. Notice the takeoff angle, the peak radiation angle, 3 degrees less than the Challenger. Remember that the Performer was 24, Challenger 21. This is 18 degrees. And look at the beam width, even more concentrated, 28 degrees. So you put a lot of power into a very narrow span. And this is the Challenger, omnidirectional in all directions, obviously. You can see that here. You can see the performance, the SWR and the reflection coefficient, again on 15 meters. Now, put your eye over here. Look at this. This is the Challenger. It looks more like a quarter wave kind of rounded radiation pattern. Now, let's go to a true half wave. Boom. It becomes very flat. You can see that. Very flat. So you can see on 15 meters, you get plus 0.6 dB at 18 degrees off the horizon, and a very narrow beam width from 7 degrees off the horizon to 34. You get great DX, great DX. This antenna has been amazing for me. Here's the reality. Look at the bandwidth. This is the Challenger now. Look at the bandwidth. The entire 20-meter band under 1.1 or better. The entire band. You don't have to retune the antenna, whether you do CW or you do sideband. Obviously, here's 17 meters. The entire 15-meter band, 1.1 or better. The entire 15-meter band. Think about that. Here's the 12-meter band. Here's the 10-meter band. Again, the entire band's under 1.5, so you don't have to change the antenna if you don't want to. Because remember, 1.5 or better, you're getting 96% efficiency, which exceeds the efficiency of the antenna, so you're in good shape. And of course, on 6 meters, the Challenger does really well, very flat, as you can see here. Look at the Dominator, same thing. Now the Dominator, because it's a true half wave, you don't have enough whip to get 20 meters. You could fake it, but I don't know if you want to make that long of a whip. Most of my DX is on 10, 12, and 15 anyway, but you can see it's also extremely broadbanded.
Have you thought about putting a top hat on it?
Yeah, you know, Chameleon is working on a top hat for their whips. And as soon as they come out with it, I'm going to buy it. And I bet you I can run this antenna on 20 meters because of that. It makes me nervous to put I think Alpha Delta has a 32 foot, which I think would work for 20 meters. But when you get a whip that big, it makes me nervous. You know, you get a little bit of wind and that thing's going to topple over unless you guy it. And I don't want to do that. So I like the idea of a top hat. I tried building my own, but it kept bending the whip. It works, but I'm going to wait to see what they come up with. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's summarize some of these antennas to give you an idea. Let's pull it all together. 3 antennas: quarter wave, half wave, off-center fed, half wave, end fed. Band coverage, the Performer gets 40 meters, the others don't. The Challenger gets 20 meters on half wave. The Dominator does not. It also gets 6. Structural efficiency, all over 90%. To match the impedance, obviously you don't have to on the Performer quarter wave, but use a 41 on here, or 49 or 56 to 1 transformer on the end-fed half wave. Peak radiation, again, omnidirectional, minus 0.67, minus 0.27, plus 0.67. When the Performer is with a 90-degree radials, you get your plus 0.41. So look, it's getting closer to the Dominator. But that's a little bit deceptive, which I'll show you, primarily because of the angle of peak radiation, the takeoff angle. Quarter wave 24, 3 less on the Challenger, 3 less on the Dominator. Here's the beam width, 46 degrees on the quarter wave, much narrower on the Challenger, slightly narrower on the Dominator. I call this the regional continental antenna, this the continental global. The DX Dominator, that's my baby for that. This is a kind of a visual representation to kind of give you an idea. Here's the Performer, 24 degrees. Here's the beam width from 9 to 54 degrees off the horizon. Remember I said regional is between 30 and 60, so you get a lot of regional coverage here. You also get DX. I get DX on the Performer all the time because look, you're down to 9 degrees on the beam width. But you go to the Challenger, then all of a sudden you drop 3 degrees here, you tighten up the beam width by 14 degrees, and you go to the Dominator, 3 degrees lower, and you tighten up the beam width even more. So you get more gain as you go through the antennas, lower takeoff angle, tighter beam width. That's how they're, I use, every antenna is good for a different reason. So it depends on what you want to do with the antenna. Let's overlay all the radiation patterns. You can see the Performer in its omnidirectional configuration is in green. The Challenger off-center fed half wave is in red. The Dominator end-fed half wave is in blue. Let's zoom in, take a look at it. Notice that the 18 degrees off the horizon where the Dominator is peaking 0.68 dBi, the Challenger is minus 0.32, Performer is minus 1. And you can see right about, what is that? That's 15, 20 degrees, right around, little over, no, 30 degrees. I'm sorry. This is 5. So that's 15, 20, 25, 30 degrees. You can see the Performer in his omnidirectional gives you better regional coverage than the other two antennas do. But the Dominator, clearly, look at that. There's your DX right there. But let's put the Performer in its 90-degree radial configuration, and look what happens. And this is why the Performer in that configuration is so very popular. Let's zoom in on it. Comparing the radiated gain, the Performer exceeds the Challenger at 16 degrees off the horizon, and it exceeds the Dominator at 23 degrees off the horizon. So there's all your regional coverage right there. The Dominator is still the DX king. I would dare say the Challenger is as well. However, the Performer in this configuration, look how it's pretty much right in the middle between the two at this relatively good low angle of radiation. This is 15 degrees. These numbers are, you subtract 90 from it. This is 15 degrees, there's 20, and there's 25. So that's why the Performer with the two elevated radials is so popular. So again, to summarize, all three antennas, per my design recommendations or principles, I should call them, high efficiency, fast deployment, easy to pack and transport. The Performer has 40 meters. It's really the best antenna for 30 to 60 degree regional coverage, and why it's so popular for HOAs and POTA and ecom and emergency communications, because it does have some NVIS components. The Dominator, on the other hand, is the best antenna for 5 to 20 degree global coverage. It has the strongest radiation at 0.67, the lowest angle of radiation. However, the Challenger, right in the middle, it fits perfectly in between, has the highest radiation efficiency of all three antennas. It also gives you 20 meters and 6 meters, which a Dominator does not. So I call it the best antenna for balanced coverage. Wait, there's more. You think the Dominator was the DX Dominator? Well, let's put a parasitic director on the front of it. So what I've done here, and this is me kind of just being a geeky goofball, but boy, does this work. I am blown away. This is the antenna I was using, by the way, to work over the pole, park to parks in Europe from California. So this is the Dominator, okay? And this is actually the Dominator, not the Plus. This is the Dominator before I got the 56-to-1, but it's still an excellent antenna. And here it is at the POTA park. This PVC structure, which you see here, and this parasitic director in front of it is what gives it makes it a 2-element vertical beam for 17 to 10 meters. 2-element vertical beam with up to not 0.67, but plus 4 dB gain in the direction of the parasitic director. Now, if you don't know what a parasitic director means, it means it's just another piece of metal, roughly 6% shorter than the radiator, and a specified distance, depending on the band, away from the radiator. Okay, that's called a parasitic director. And I chose a director over a reflector because a director gives you a little bit more gain. It's a little bit shorter distance between here and here. The reflector has to go much further back, and it becomes more unstable back there. So that's why I like a parasitic director. How do I deploy it? Well, I came up with this kind of, I think it's kind of clever. A tube within a tube. I call it the trombone. So I found a PVC tube and one that's slightly smaller, and I have a PDF which tells you how to build this whole PVC structure here. And of course, you will need a second whip. There's no question about that. But notice the feed point is only on the radiator and the counterpoise is only on the radiator. This is just another piece of metal in front of it, 6% shorter and a specified distance. But each band, this has to move further and further away. So the trombone, what does that do? I mark the trombone, here it is for 10 meters. It has to be further away for 12 meters. So I have another mark on this tube within that tube. And that tells me that's the 12-meter mark. And then I extend the whip a little bit. Then I have a 15-meter mark and I have a 17-meter mark. And that's how I get the trombone to give me the distance between the two elements. And then you just adjust the length of your two whips for that particular band. It's a lot easier than you think because you have to adjust two whips. There's a little bit of tweaking. It takes a little longer instead of 30 seconds, more like 2 minutes, but it's worth it. And here's the structure in the field at the park. This is the day I actually worked. This is pointed north in the park. This is the day, well, actually north, slightly northeast, east of north, going over the pole to Europe. And I was getting POTA parks in Europe. It just blew me away. It's extremely portable, just like the Dominator. It's just a second whip. Here's the photography bag I told you about. Everything fits inside, except for, of course, the PVC mount. And I tell you how to build this. It's just made of 3 components. Everything's glued except for a couple components. Here's the vertical piece. This lays on top of the Dominator where the mirror mount is. Here's your trombone that goes in and out to adjust your distance between the director and the radiator, which is over here. This is the vertical piece, which hooks on over there. And here's your bass, which hooks into that. So it stores flat. It goes in your car flat. When you go in the field, it takes you literally 10 seconds to put together. Look at that. Look at that computer model. Look at that. Look at that's just it's 16 degrees off the horizon. So it's even 2 degrees lower than the Dominator, the takeoff angle. It's amazing. 4 dB gain. Here is the Dominator in red versus the Dominator beam in blue. The picture speaks 1,000 words. On 10 meters, it's got a gain of 4 dBi at 16 degrees off the horizon, so even lower than the Dominator, and the efficiency is 99.5%. Structural. When you add the 56-to-1, that drops to about 92%, but still, that's amazing. Here's the reality. On the day that I was working Europe, 17 meters, obviously completely flat. The entire 15-meter band under 1.2. Obviously, the 12-meter band completely flat. 10 meter, the entire 10-meter band, 1.2 or better. That's the Dominator beam. So here's a summary. Here's the other 3 antennas. Here's the beam over here. Versus 0.67, you now get an average across all the bands, plus 3.5 dBi. 2 degrees lower, as I mentioned, and even the beam width is tightened up a bit more. So you're concentrating all of your primary radiated power out the front of this thing in the direction of the parasitic director. And by the way, the way I've set it up, if I go back to this picture over here, you see this over here? How do you rotate your beam? You just walk over, you lift this up slightly, and because it's like a little loop here, it just rotates around in a circle. So I can go north, I can go east, I can go south, I can work Japan and Australia by pointing it over here. I mean, it's a lot of fun to play with when you're in the field. I wouldn't call it a backpack antenna, though. It's a portable antenna. I wouldn't put it in my backpack, though. You probably could. But... Okay, so that's the end of the formal presentation. If you want to get on my Antenna Geeks email list, I only send out, 5, 6 emails a year. So I'm not going to spam you. But I do always share my links. And as I said, I keep them updated constantly because I believe in continuous improvement, living documents. That's what I learned in my career. And I kept going here in my retirement. And that's the end of it. And, you can donate if you'd like. It helps me buy all these parts and pieces to experiment with, but it's optional. You don't have to do that. I gladly accept donations, however. Okay, there you go.